me direct questions about, how we would define the why of our organization or the why of our faith community. And then, of course, I was inspired by the conversation, and I had like 17 credits on Audible because I've been neglecting it. And so I downloaded Start With Why, and I've been listening to it this week. Thursday, I had a phone call from a mentor of mine, and we talked for about an hour. The last half of the conversation turned to the how compelling it is when we understand what our why is really all about. And then I had a conversation with a mentor of mine on Saturday morning. After about 20 minutes of conversation, he said to me, and we hadn't been talking about Simon Sinek, just about life. And he said, it sounds to me like you need to do some work and reconnect with your why. And so it kind of hit me all throughout the week as I was contemplating this. And then as I read this text this week, as what the Spirit was saying through the text and what the Spirit was saying through my friends, kind of came together for me in that what we see in Paul's fortitude in these passages can only come from a person who is very well aware of their why. Paul knew his what, proclaim the gospel among the Gentiles. He knew his how. He had to go on missionary journeys into Gentile lands. But the power wasn't his what or his how. The power is in his why. And his why was discovered on that Damascus road, which is why Luke spends 3 different times in the book of Acts to point back to that testimony. So one of the things that we talked about last week is this understanding that one of the goals and consequences of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus is that he forever fulfilled and altered the practice of religion as it was practiced until his coming. Now, Paul understood this, and because Paul understood this, he understood that one of the ways that we're changing is we have to make the proclamation that all the Gentile nations, all the nations of the earth, are included in God's redemptive action in salvation. He had the revelation that the Gentiles were not far off from God, and Paul understood that he was chosen to declare that message among them. Paul knew his what and his how, but most importantly, he understood his why. And I believe understanding his why is what contributes to the character and his fortitude of character as he's facing false accusation. These are accusations that are birthed out of lies and rumors, which we've talked about in the previous 2 weeks. So we won't go back into that. But here he is declaring his innocence. And as we looked at last week, the way he chooses to defend his innocence is by sharing his story. Because in sharing his story, we see the revelation of his why. So let's pick it up where we ended it last week. And this is where the last thing he says before the crowd, in verse 21 of chapter 22, he said to me, speaking of God, saying to Paul on the Damascus road, go, because I will send you far away to the Gentiles. Go, because I will send you far away to the Gentiles. Verse 22. They listened to him up to this point. Up to what point? Until he said that God was sending him to the Gentiles. Then things change. They raised their voices, shouting, wipe this man off the face of the earth. He should not be allowed to live. These are strong statements. Remember, we've talked a lot about the past few weeks of the way in which their own religion was married to their own nationalism, and the way that gave them a very energetic, focused expression of their faith. So this nationalism is so deeply rooted into the heart of who they are that they have trouble understanding that the heart of God has always been revealed, that he has been for blessing the Gentiles. But they can't see that. So as soon as he says it, they react very strongly to the point that they're saying he should be murdered, he should be executed, he should not be allowed to live. Verse 23, as they were yelling and flinging aside their garments and throwing dust into the air, the commander ordered him to be brought into the barracks, directing that he be interrogated with the scourge to discover the reason they were shouting against him like this. So all of a sudden there's just chaos. People ripping off their robes or throwing dust in the air. They are performing the actions that speak of protest and lament. Why are they protesting? Why are they lamenting? They're protesting and lamenting because Paul is celebrating and has the audacity to suggest that God came to him in a vision and said to him that he's supposed to go and reach the Gentiles, to be sent far away to the Gentiles. Now, this attitude, this exclusive nationalistic attitude had taken deep root of the people and the culture of that time, both the leaders and the devout followers of the law. In fact, we don't just see this attitude reacting so strongly in the book of Acts. This is the very attitude that was instrumental in the crucifixion of Jesus. And so, for example, we might recall back in Luke chapter 4, they'll be on the overhead, but it's also in your notes. Luke chapter 4, where Jesus is speaking in the synagogue, we pick up the narrative in verse 24. He, being Jesus, also said, "Truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in his hometown. But I say to you, there were certainly many widows in Israel in Elijah's days, when the sky was shut up for 3 years and 6 months, while a great famine came over all the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, except a widow at Zarephath in Sidon. And in the prophet Elisha's time, there were many in Israel who had leprosy, and yet not one of them was cleansed except Naaman the Syrian." Now, the point he's trying to make here is God is reaching out and he's blessing foreigners. A woman from Sidon and a man from Syria. So he's highlighting the fact that during that time, God went to those people to bring blessing and to bring healing. Verse 28 is very similar to verse 22 of Acts chapter 22. When they heard this, everyone in the synagogue was enraged. They got up, drove him out of town, and brought him to the edge of the hill that their town was also built on, intending to hurl him off the cliff. But he passed right through the crowd and went on his way. Now, the story of the Gospels reveals to us that eventually the crowd got their way. Instead of hurling him off a cliff, though, they hung him on a cross. But eventually, but that was the fruition of this spirit that we see from the very beginning of Jesus' ministry. This idea, this offensive idea that God's blessing of the Gentile nations created on the part of their hearers. Now then, I think it's important for us to appreciate that this isn't just simply nationalistic pride. You're talking about that they are being confronted with the idea of blessing the very nations that attacked them, abused them, took them off to other cities and other nations. And here they are under submission to the Gentile Roman government rather than being independently the people of God, following the law of God within the context of their own restored nation. And so when we're talking about this and we see that they're being enraged, you have to remember this would be like sentiments that people felt during certain ethnicities during wartime. This touches on the kind of sentiments that's felt in a nation whenever they've experienced a terrorist attack and they have an ethnicity or a people group of an ideology that are claiming responsibility for that attack, and then the posture that those people in that nation have toward the enemy that's attacked them. This is the realm of emotions that's being touched upon by both Jesus and Paul when they talk about God's heart being for blessing the Gentile nations. And so this idea, this offense toward the inclusive nature of God's redemptive acts is deeply rooted in the people at this time, both in the times of Jesus and now Paul is confronting that same spirit, if you will. Verse 25, as they stretched him out for the lash, Paul said to the centurion standing by, is it legal for you to scourge a man who is a Roman citizen and is uncondemned? When the centurion heard this, he went and reported to the commander, saying, what are you going to do? For this man is a Roman citizen. The commander came and said to him, tell me, are you a Roman citizen? Yes, he said. The commander replied, I bought this citizenship. Apparently, he's taking out his papers that legitimizes his claim to citizenship. But this is the commander speaking, not Paul. I bought this citizenship for a large amount of money, but I was born a citizen, Paul said. So those who were about to examine him withdrew from him immediately. The commander, too, was alarmed when he realized Paul was a Roman citizen and he had bound him. They know they're in trouble. It was against the law to bind a Roman, an uncondemned citizen, and especially to beat him, which is what they were about to do. But what is interesting here, and I will try to just dip into this for a second because it's a little bit of nerdy specifics. But this speaks to the compelling power of knowing your why. Because too many times, contemporary Christians in America who mistake the mission of the gospel as being the mission of becoming a cultural warrior, whether you are warring for the ideals of the right or warring for the ideals of the left. The mistake whenever we begin to view ourselves or see ourselves as culture warriors is that we interpret our offense and our anger as righteousness. We assume that if I am offended and if I'm angry, it comes from a place of righteousness. That's what I assume as well. That's the kind of language that I use. What I want to encourage us to do today is to consider the possibility that anger and that offense does not come from righteousness, but rather comes from deep-seated insecurity. Either about ourselves or our belief system or our ideals. Maybe the Spirit is inviting us into a season of deconstruction like we talked about last week, but we're resisting because we want the safety of construction. And so, therefore, it creates an insecurity in our heart. But whenever we start to respond as angry cultural warriors, it might not be for righteous reasons. In fact, James will go on to tell the people of the first century that man's anger will not bring about God's righteousness. But isn't it amazing the simple things of Scripture that we continually disregard? Because I was definitely raised to believe that my anger could bring about God's righteousness. If not in the church, then maybe at least in the political realm. And so here we see, though, the Apostle Paul in this extremely tense environment where by the end of the day, he could be murdered. And we'll go on to see where he's not even out of danger yet. And he's being falsely accused. And you can imagine what the adrenaline must be like. He's there to defend his life, but also honor his call to proclaim the gospel among the Gentiles. And here in this situation, though, the way he composes and possesses himself can only happen in that particular circumstance from a man or a woman who is deeply compelled internally because they understand their why. Not just what they're called to do, not just how they're called to do it, not just who they are, but why they are. And so here we see Paul postured before these Roman centurions. He's been taken away from the crowd, so now he's not in a situation where the Jews are hearing the conversation. And what's interesting is that just now Paul decides to play his citizenship card. He could have done this earlier, but he doesn't. He participates in the escalation of this anger, rage, and violence. He doesn't say anything about his Roman citizenship, to the extent that those that are there to keep to enforce the law would have assumed, well, before you've gotten into this much trouble, you would have proclaimed your citizenship. Since you haven't, you're probably not a citizen. Therefore, we're going to take you back to the barracks and interrogate you with the scourge of the whip. But then that's when he reveals that he is a Roman citizen. You see, Paul knew that his claim of Roman citizenship would not have gone over with the Jewish nationalist at all. So he lovingly chose a course of action that would reduce the possibility of offense on behalf of those he was trying to reach. Paul is still committed to honoring the growth of the gospel message, even when it creates hardship for himself. He endures the hardship, and he doesn't do the thing that would have increased the offense on behalf of the Jews, even though that thing would have saved him being in this predicament of danger. He holds back. When he's with the Roman centurion, then he reveals it. And in claiming his Roman citizenship, ironically, Paul is going to be saved and protected not by the people of God, but by the civil government. And then we have this exchange where Paul reveals that the hope that he has is the fulfillment of the promises that God has given to the Jews, and the confirmation of that fulfillment is the resurrection of Jesus, which we will celebrate here in just a bit. But unfortunately, the religious leaders have become so blinded by the practice of tradition that they cannot see the very fruit to which that tradition points. We actually talked about this in Sunday school this morning as we were looking at the parable of the lost sheep and the lost coin and the lost son. We were looking at how offensive it can be to feel like you're part of the 99 being neglected while the gracious shepherd goes after the one who's lost. So we all get moved into that, or that very offensive parable where Jesus says that a laborer went and hired workers at 9 a.m. for a salary. Then he hires workers at noon for the same salary, and then workers at 3 for the same salary, which doesn't offend the 9 a.m. workers because they assume that there'll probably be a prorated compensation. But they're offended when they realize, wow, you just did for me what we agreed upon. But this isn't fair. And so this nature of fairness is constantly challenging our ability to rest in the grace and mercy of God. We are grateful that God isn't fair when we're aware of our need for his mercy and grace. Then we celebrate the unfair God who is irresponsibly gratuitous with his mercy. But when we're in a more secure spot, and that mercy and grace is being given to those that we deem unworthy, then that same offense begins to stir in our own souls as well. Darrell Bock says about this particular group of religious leaders, the unwillingness of Paul's opponents to consider how God's recent activity relates to God's promise and program has made them unwilling and unable to respond to a hope that was designed for them. But here, that hope is in front of them. They are included in that hope, but they disqualify themselves because of their unwillingness to embrace it. Unwillingness to embrace God's grace can rob us of the experience of God's grace. And the irony for religious people is we stumble not at the point of our unrighteousness. We stumble at the point of our self-righteousness. It is our self-righteousness that lulls our souls to sleep, thinking we are in less need of mercy and grace than those who are less righteous than ourselves. This is the thing that becomes the cancer that can bring death. Well, so the Civil leaders, government leaders, they're not sure what they do, but they thought, oh, we will call in religious authority. We'll confer with the religious authority, and then we'll have some understanding of what has been going on here with this man. So we pick that narrative up in verse 30, and we move on into chapter 23. The next day, he wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews. He released him and instructed the chief priests and all the Sanhedrin to convene. And he brought Paul down and placed him before them. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, brothers. Now, again, you see what Paul does. He immediately begins with the affirmation of sameness. He doesn't treat them as us and them. He immediately moves into affirming his connection with them. So what does he do? He starts by calling them his brothers. Brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience to this day. The high priest Ananias ordered those who were standing next to him to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Now here he slips into being a good contemporary evangelical. Okay? He spouts off, reacts strongly in anger. You strike me, God's going to strike you. You are sitting there judging me according to the law, and yet in violation of the law, are you ordering me to be struck? Those standing nearby said, do you dare revile God's priest? Verse 5. This is a dull statement, especially if we're not appreciating their story, but this statement blows me away. I didn't know, brothers, that he was the high priest, replied Paul. For it is written, you must not speak evil of a ruler of your people. I cannot comprehend this. Paul is innocent. They are in the wrong. And yet, even though he's innocent, he's being falsely accused, and now he's being struck on the face by the religious leadership. And yet, what does he do? He responds first with this understandable response of anger and frustration, and then dials it back and owns his wrongdoing before those who are doing wrong. Man, that's significant dying to the ego. That is being willing to put my life on the cross and take up my cross and follow Jesus in the service of others, because this is what he does. His anger quickly switches to a posture of humility. Paul appears to lose his temper, but then he pulls back and acknowledges his error. Paul submits himself to the law in order to reach those under the law. So he acknowledges that he disrespected the law by speaking out against a ruler, and then quotes the law to affirm their supposed right to be offended at him. Now think about what Paul has just done. He was willing to curtail his anger for the sake of the mission. Why? Only because he knew his why. You see, if we're just what people or how people, we can't crucify our anger for the sake of the mission. We're so focused on the what and the how that we will justify ourselves. And here his anger would have been justifiable. It's so easy, especially if I perceive that I'm clearly in the right, to justify anti-Christ behavior. But see, this is the thing that begins to destroy the beauty and the innocence of my faith. I have to recognize that Christian discipleship is not the call to be right, but the call to be like Christ. And it is so easily to be seduced to thinking that this life is all about what we believe and making sure we have the right theology, and that we're then policing those who have the wrong theology. When in reality, our first and foremost, really our only goal is to posture ourselves in such a way that we're following Jesus and we're reflecting the life of Christ. And so that whenever we step out of that, we can quickly move back into that place of correction. John Stott said this about this passage: despite the opposition There is a respect that Paul seeks to embody as he communicates. And when it is pointed out that he has crossed that line into disrespect, he acknowledges it. How profound and miraculous. Disrespect is just the assumed posture of communication in the climate of contemporary America. And it doesn't matter which side of the fence you're on. In fact, whatever ideological side you're on will so convince you of the rightness of your position that it will even justify antichrist behavior as long as I'm representing the right side of my ideology. But this too is sin. This too will make us ineffective, and it comes from focusing only on the what and the how and not taking time and humility to really be compelled by the why. So for Paul, he could submit in humility and become all things to all people because his purpose was to win them, not merely convince them. But we think the mission is to convince, and so we stay in the realm of ideas and we justify unchristlike behavior. Paul understood that he was called to something larger than that. So then verse 6, when Paul realized that one part of them were Sadducees, this is great. Let's jump into the narrative here. When Paul realized that one of them were Sadducees and the other part were Pharisees, he cried out in the Sanhedrin, "Brothers, I'm a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. I'm being judged because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead." Now, this is very interesting because you can, in a broader philosophical sense, trace his situation back to this conviction. But this is not exactly the presenting conviction. This was actually a dispute that took place because of temple activity, because he was perceived to have brought Gentiles into the temple. Now for Paul, being there in the temple and fellowshipping with the Gentiles were an outwork of the hope that he had. But this is not specifically what he's in trial for, but this is what he claims. Now, why does he do that? Verse 7. When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. For the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, and neither angel nor spirit, but the Pharisees affirmed them all. The shouting grew loud, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees' party got up and argued vehemently, "We find nothing evil in this man, but what if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?" Now, this is a little bit of a confusing paragraph here because the whole thing turns around. Paul's saying, yes, I shouldn't have been disrespectful. And then it's like he's reading the crowd. He's going, oh, we got Sadducees, we got Pharisees. Right now, they're united in their resistance to me. But perhaps if I can get them disunited by their resistance toward one another, then maybe things will change. That's exactly what he does. He knows the Sadducees are offended by the idea of hearing from an angel or hearing from spirits, which Paul claims happened to him whenever he was in the desert. And he also knows that they don't believe in the hope of the resurrection. So if he makes this about, hey, I'm here because of the hope of the resurrection, then at least they will divide against one another and one side will actually claim me as innocent, which is exactly what they did, which is great because it shows you the power of blind commitment to ideology. These Pharisees, if they had the opportunity to get to know Paul and his message, they would not be behind him. They would not be defending him. They would not be affirming him. But all they see is a hat tip to their ideology. And that's enough to say, hey, there's nothing wrong. This man is innocent. So Paul defends his faith with an understanding not just of what he believes, but he is able to contextualize it in relationship to those who are hearing them. And so one of the things that you see here about a person who knows their why is they don't have to be afraid of understanding their enemies. But if we don't know our why, and all we're focused on is the what and the how, then we become very insecure in the midst of our enemies, particularly if they are challenging our ideology. But because Paul was so convinced, he took time to actually understand his enemies. Now, I want to be careful here in applying from their story to our story, because I really don't want to be misunderstood. In youthful arrogance, didn't mind for people to misunderstand me, but it does bother me now. So what I'm speaking to here isn't what we're convicted of. I'm speaking to how we hold our convictions. And in particular, how we hold our convictions in light of someone else's convictions and beliefs. See, Paul was secure enough to be able to understand the people that even disagreed with him, understanding both the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And this is the challenge when believers get preoccupied in culture wars. Because when we get preoccupied in culture wars, all we're concerned with is whether or not we can defend what we believe to be right. And then, when an opponent is in front of us, we are immediately trained to not see a person. We see a brand, or we see an ideology. And when we see a brand or an ideology, it allows us mentally to dehumanize them, and therefore justifies my posturing myself toward them in such a way that I'm actually displaying Antichrist behavior rather than standing before them in the Spirit of Christ. So, a fun thought experiment this morning might be for you to contemplate your ideological opponents. Are they your opponents because they believe differently than you in regards to their political philosophy? Are they your opponents because they're of a different belief system than you? Or are they're your opponents because they don't have a belief system? Or worse, are they your opponents because they used to be part of your belief system and then they left it? Or is your opponent offensive because of their lifestyle choices? Or because of the way that they understand human sexuality? If we're going to be a relevant people of faith, these are the kinds of conversations that we are going to have to learn to become comfortable having. Because if our goal is something more than just to pick a conviction and defend it, if our goal is to actually understand the humanity of our opponents, then we will have to get past offensive ideology and take time to actually listen. To not only understand our story, but to understand their story. It doesn't mean that I have to agree with my opponent. It simply means that because of my why, I can hold some restraint in the area of my emotions. And rather getting offended, I can take time to listen to someone's story. Do you know how profound that is? When I wasn't in ministry, I didn't have time for, I didn't think I had time for, or I could justify not listening to anyone else. And then I got this job, which I thought was just going to be putting on a monk's robe 8 to 5 and sitting before the Lord and having, a spiritual life and getting paid to do it. But no, you got to get nitty gritty. You got to start listening to people. And so it brought me into the world of what we might call pastoral counseling, where you're just walking with people to help them sort through whatever challenges they may be facing. And people would come with a presenting problem, oftentimes a presenting problem that I've never struggled with. Sometimes I would have empathy for the struggle, and of course, if they were struggling with something that I could understand, that was more legitimate. That was easier to have compassion for. But oftentimes it would be with struggles that I didn't understand. And yet, because of the life to which God had called me, I took time to understand who they were. I heard their story. And I can say this with 100% honesty. always come to the point when I travel with someone long enough that I can honestly say, if I were them and I had their particular temperament and their particular temperament strengths and weaknesses, and the things that happened to them in their story happened to me, I don't think I'd be doing as well as they're doing. I think I might be undone by that. And I certainly would understand why they would make choices that I ideologically disagree with. My friends, there's power there. Then we stop being brands and we stop being ideologies, and we're humans suffering from the same brokenness of the human condition, and yet we can be aware of the why because we're aware of the way in which Jesus has entered into our brokenness and brought restoration and wholeness. And then all of a sudden we are equipped by the Holy Spirit to continue to do the same things. What if God didn't save you so that you could have the assurance of heaven when you die? What if God saved you so that you could be part of his saving others? And if we look at the New Testament and the thrust of discipleship, I think that's more of where we have to move toward. I'm saved so that I can participate in God's intent to save others. So Paul is able to understand his enemies. He's able to understand where they're coming from, even if he disagrees, and that's what makes him effective. The last few verses. When the dispute became violent, the commander feared that Paul might be torn apart from them. This is not a euphemism. This is literally what he was afraid of. Torn apart by them, and ordered the troops to go down, take him away from them, and bring him into the barracks. Verse 11. The following night, the Lord stood by him and said, "Have courage. For as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so it is necessary for you to testify in Rome." And this closes out this part of the section. Now, it's really interesting. I don't know about you, but I would love to go to sleep tonight and see a vision of Jesus and have him speak affirmation to me like, "Artie, take courage." You know what the prerequisite of hearing the Lord say to you, "Take courage," is? You've got to be deathly afraid. God's affirmation doesn't come to us as a parlor trick. It comes to empower us in the face of extreme trial and opposition. That is why the Spirit speaks that word of affirmation. And the fact of the matter is, I've realized a lot that the reason why I don't more frequently hear the Lord's affirmation is because I'm neglecting his work. I need it more when I'm giving myself over to his work. I need it more when I'm understanding and responding to the why that he's put down in my soul. So here in all this chaos, what Paul realizes is this: Jesus has been with him all along. Even in those moments where he thought his life might be lost, the Lord was there with him. And what does he do? He reminds Paul of what? His why. The way you endure this trial, Paul, is to remember why you're here. You can have courage because I have made you the one that's to proclaim the gospel to the Gentiles. That is your why, and that is why you can have courage. And so in the end, this is what he enters into. This is what he's left with. God's command to Paul is to have courage is rooted in his awareness of his mission. Courageous obedience is the fruit of understanding our why. Legalism and discipline can empower you sometimes to do what you should do. But only the grace of God and understanding your why can move your posture of should to must. This is not just simply what I should do. This is what I must do. Is the posture of your obedience, has it traveled from being a posture of should to a posture of must? Because I have been embraced by Jesus, this is what I must do with my life. So as we come to a close and we take from their story, we jump to our story and my story. A few thoughts. Before we truly understand our what, we must understand our why. Before we can figure out our how, we must understand our why. And because Paul understood his why, he was able to offer a defense without being defensive. Because Paul understood his why, he was able to be effective with his opponents by taking time to understand them. Because Paul understood his why, he is an effective witness because he was secure enough to own his own disrespect and correct it and say, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. It was one of the most powerful evangelistic tools that the church has, is a willingness to be humble and apologize. To just say, we didn't get this right. I didn't get this right. Before we can answer the question about what we're called to do and how we're called to do it, we must understand why we have been called to serve the mission of the gospel. So, as we get ready to close and as we get ready to come to the Lord's table and create some space to pray and reflect, I want to ask you a few questions. Why are you following Jesus? And why do you feel that others should do the same? This is why you have to understand your own story. And my friend that I was speaking to Saturday said, you have to go through at least 7 layers of why. So when you stop and you ask yourself, why am I following Jesus? And why do I think it's important why is it important to me that I convince others to do the same? The first answer might be your mom and dad's answer. It might be your pastor's answer. It might be the answer that you took away from Sunday school. So you write that answer down and you ask why of that question. And you keep asking why until you get down to your answer. What is your answer that is rooted in your experience with Jesus? Why is Jesus compelling to you? Paul said it this way in Philippians 3:12. I think we looked at this last week. Not that I have already reached the goal or am already perfect, but I make every effort to take hold of it because I also have been taken hold of by Christ Jesus. You see, we discover our what and how by understanding why we've chosen to take hold of Jesus. But our why is rooted in the question of understanding of why Jesus chose to take hold of us. Why did Jesus take hold of you? That's the question you've got to wrestle before the presence of the Lord and allow the Holy Spirit to bring his breath of revelation. The worship team will come forward and we get ready to take communion. As you come to the Lord's table to be nourished by the living Christ, come with these questions on your heart. Maybe you've never thought about it, or maybe you've thought about it years ago, but it's been a while. And like me, you need a phone call that says, it sounds like to me, you need to reconnect with your why. Why is Jesus compelling? Why did he take hold of you? What is the work that he's given you to do in this season of your life? Because it will transition. On the night that our Lord was betrayed, he took the bread and he broke it and said, this is my body given for you. Take and eat in remembrance of me. He then poured the wine and said, this is my blood of the new covenant, shed for the forgiveness of sins. Take and drink and